I was searching for the car keys in the vegetable section, bending down with such care, as if each potato could hide the missing item behind it. Suddenly, as if from nowhere, a pair of men's shoes appeared. I looked up and immediately recognized him. Alex. In that moment, I forgot I was in a supermarket. Everything around me became secondary: the bright price tags, the shelves of bananas. Even the radish I had been fiddling with for so long suddenly felt distant, unimportant. Alex was standing in front of me, tall, confident, with a barely perceptible smile on his lips, as though he wasn't too surprised by my confusion. I hadn't seen him in a long time. When he was still a boy, I had always thought of him as a bit clumsy, adolescent, but now he stood before me, grown, with a kind of hidden charm that was unfamiliar to me. He had changed, and so had I, probably, but at that moment, I didn't care about that. "Did you lose something?" he asked, and his voice was warm and low, like those who know how to speak confidently, but not harshly. "The keys," I answered, though it was obvious. At the moment when I knelt down to check if they had rolled into a corner, my fingers touched something hard. I quickly picked up the keys and felt a strange sense of relief, not so much from having found them, but from the fact that no one was rushing me or asking questions. I knew that I would need to remember this moment. "Let me help." Alex extended his hand, and I couldn't refuse, although it felt strange, standing in front of a person I hadn't spoken to in years. "No thanks, I'll manage." I straightened up, noticing how uncomfortable I felt standing in front of him. I was flustered but tried to smile. "It's nice to see you." "It's fate, right?" he said, and I sensed something deeper in his words than just a joke. "I didn't know you lived here." He smiled and added, "I don't want to keep you, but if you'd like, I can help with the shopping." I considered his offer, but immediately felt something inside me resisting. It was as if accepting help wasn't right, as if I shouldn't get used to this attention, even though I had longed for a little care. Suddenly, as in life, I had to make a choice: to allow this moment into my life or to leave things as they were, in their usual order. "All right," I said finally, and the word felt like permission. A couple of hours later, when I had somewhat recovered from the unexpected encounter, the doorbell rang. I glanced at the clock. It was 7 p.m. It was too early for a visit and too late for a usual guest. I opened the door and froze. Alex was standing on the threshold holding a bottle of wine, as if there hadn't been years of silence between us. His smile was as confident as it had been in the supermarket, and I felt my heart slow down just a little. "Hey," he said, keeping his pace. "I thought, since we've already run into each other, why not continue the conversation? I brought wine, good old wine. You don't mind, do you?" "Well, come in," I said, letting him into the hallway. He immediately scanned the room. His gaze quickly swept over the entire interior, and I felt myself blush. The house looked just as it always did, a little neglected, a little untidy. In the corner stood a cabinet with dishes, on top of which lay some dusty old books, and on the couch were scattered magazines that I had never gotten around to sorting. "You've got a cozy place," he remarked, a hint of curiosity in his voice, and I felt a little uncomfortable. He was clearly comparing this space to what he had seen before when he was still a teenager. It was a strange feeling, seeing him like this as an adult, while also feeling him measuring what had changed and what remained the same. I quickly cleared a few magazines off the couch, trying not to reveal too much of my embarrassment. "Thanks," I said, trying to smile. "I didn't expect you to drop by." Alex smirked, pouring wine into glasses. He was completely relaxed, while I felt a strange tension bubbling inside me. "No need to apologize," he said, raising his glass. "Life's just like that. You never know when you'll run into someone with whom it's so easy to find common ground." We sat at the table, and the conversation quickly shifted to light topics: the weather, the news, travel. But something felt off in this conversation. I tried to avoid more personal topics, not wanting to reveal too much to him. Yet despite my efforts, he touched on something I had been dreading. "How are you?" he suddenly asked. "You look a little tired. Is everything okay?" I froze, unsure how to respond. The question was too direct, too open. He wasn't asking politely, he genuinely wanted to know. And I felt my mask starting to crack. "I'm just tired," I replied, trying to keep neutrality in my voice. "A lot of work, you know." He looked at me intently, his eyes fixed on mine, and I realized he didn't believe me. He could see that something was wrong, something hidden. "You don't have to answer," he said gently, "but if you want to talk, I'm here." It became unbearably difficult. At that moment, I felt the air around me growing thick, as though this evening, this visit, was violating my usual boundaries. Too much honesty, too much attention, and I didn't know if I was ready for that. When Alex left, I felt a strange weight on my chest. It was something more than just the awkwardness of his unexpected visit. All evening, he had been watching me, following every movement I made, as if he were trying to figure me out. He noticed how I pressed my lips together when I became uncomfortable, and how I fidgeted with my fingers when I tried to hide my anxiety. And then, he told me I looked tired. Tired. That word kept echoing in my head, and I couldn't shake it off. I had always considered myself resilient, always thought I could keep everything under control, but now, after his words, I felt how fragile that illusion was. When Alex left, the house became quieter. Too quiet. George had gone on a business trip for a week, and I hadn't even realized how empty the walls had become. Every corner seemed abandoned, every room filled with things I hadn't noticed before, unspoken words that lingered in the air. I made tea and sat in the kitchen, trying to settle into my usual evening routine. The house was warm and cozy, but something was missing. I looked at the photo on the fridge. George, on vacation, in the mountains. He had always been the one to keep this house in order. The routine. But suddenly, like a tear in time, I remembered the walk Alex had suggested. He had said it would help clear my mind, and at the time I hadn't realized how deeply those words would affect me. They were sincere, and perhaps that was the problem. I had grown used to my familiar life, to the time that had frozen in its rhythm, to the conversations that seemed safe rather than stirring. But in that moment, when Alex touched my hand, when his fingers gently traced my skin, I felt something strange. It wasn't something physical. It was something else, something that penetrated deep inside, making me think. He wasn't intrusive, but his touch was deep enough to awaken something long forgotten in me. The next morning, I woke up with the feeling that something had changed. My thoughts weren't the same as usual. I couldn't think the way I used to anymore. And suddenly, I realized that everything happening in my life had become a repetition of the same story. I had tried to close my eyes to it, but I couldn't. On the kitchen counter stood an empty teacup from yesterday's tea, and as I barely noticed it, I felt that familiar thought return. Maybe everything isn't as bad as it seems? Maybe I haven't been living for a long time, but simply existing. How much time had I spent trying to maintain this facade, hiding behind it feelings that had grown weaker with each passing year? Again, mentally returning to the words Alex had said to me, I felt how this question started to sink into me. Was it worth it to stay in my little world of safety, where everything was clear, but so boring? Or should I risk it and step out of this circle? But then I would lose what was so familiar. What if this was the only way to truly feel alive again? The next morning, Alex called. I had barely finished breakfast when his name appeared on the screen. To say that I was surprised would be an understatement. We had just met, and now he was already inviting me for a walk. "Hey," he said, with that same tone that always left me speechless. "How are you? I was thinking we could take a walk along the ocean. It's refreshing, don't you think?" There was no hint of insistence in his voice, only the ease with which he made the suggestion, as if it were completely natural for him. My thoughts quickly jumped from one to another. What will I tell George? But in the end, I nodded to myself and agreed. There was something unusual about this invitation. It wasn't rehearsed, not burdened with obligations. He didn't ask for anything that would require an explanation from me. Half an hour later, I was standing on the shore, barefoot, in a simple dress, watching the waves crash against the sand. Alex was already walking beside me, silently observing how I absorbed the moment. "We'll just walk," he said, and I realized that this suggestion didn't need a reply. There were no obligations, no goals. He offered me a chance to forget everything, at least for a few hours. I walked beside him, feeling the waves wash over my feet, as if they were washing away all the doubts that had built up inside me. We were silent, but the silence was filled with something more than just the absence of words. I listened to his steps, his breathing, and it felt as though we were in sync with the endless rhythm of the ocean. The waves crashing against the sand seemed as infinite as my thoughts, but there was something soothing in that sound. "You know," Alex said, breaking the silence, "I don't like San Francisco. It's a city where everyone's in a rush, where no one looks at each other, where everyone lives only to be busy. It's hard to find silence there." I looked at him, and his gaze was fixed on the distance, as though he were watching something beyond the horizon. "And you decided to leave all of that?" I asked. He smiled slightly, but there was no lightness in it. It was a little bitter, almost thoughtful. "I'm not sure. I just know that I need to stop sometimes. Listen, feel. And when you live in a place like San Francisco, it's easy to forget what it means to simply be." We kept walking, and I felt more and more how his words were sinking into me. There was something in him that I had been missing, the ability to stop, not rush. He spoke as if he wanted to show me that there is more to life than just following your habits, your tasks. I remembered how, at one time, I had dreamed of this, a life without constant pressure. And suddenly I realized that all these years, spent in a circle of obligations and stability, had not given me what I was looking for. I had become like an empty shell, forcing myself into the expectations of others. When we reached the water, he leaned down and, without haste, extended his hand to help me across the wet sand. It was so natural, as if he had known exactly what to do for a long time. His fingers barely touched my hand, and I felt something stir inside me. But I didn't pull my hand away. On the horizon, a golden strip of sunset began to dip, and I slowed my pace, allowing myself to forget everything that awaited me in the future. This moment was the only thing that mattered. When we returned to the shore, the sunset was already glowing, and I felt how the air was filled with something almost magical. The ocean, its constant sound, and the light coolness seemed foreign to the everyday life I had grown used to. My thoughts tightly wrapped themselves around that evening, and I felt as if I were shedding a burden I hadn't noticed before. Alex didn't rush me, didn't try to explain anything. He simply walked beside me in silence, as though he knew I had to find my own way through these thoughts. And suddenly, right there on the beach, I realized that I no longer needed to search for excuses, that everything that had happened that day simply had to happen. I can't say it was the right thing, but in that moment, I felt alive. When I got home, I had a strange feeling that something had changed. But what? I didn't know. The familiar silence stood in the hallway, the emptiness as if the house had been waiting for my return. I entered the kitchen and noticed a cup left on the table by Alex, a simple cup with a barely noticeable trace of lipstick. His cup. And I realized that with each passing moment, this meeting was no longer just a coincidence. My phone buzzed with a new message. I unlocked the screen and saw a text from George. "I'll be back tomorrow morning on the train. See you soon." With that message, something new stirred in my heart. Anxiety. I put my phone down, and suddenly everything I saw around me began to seem alien, unreal. As if I had crossed some line by accident, and now everything that had been before was losing its significance. I hurried to remove the cup, but the faster I did it, the more I felt the tension building. I understood that George probably wouldn't notice anything. He was still absorbed in his business trip. His thoughts were far from me. But that no longer mattered. I felt strange, as if I were caught between two realities at once, one familiar and warm, and the other full of doubts and inexplicable desires. The doorbell made me jump. It was George. He had come earlier, returning from his trip a day earlier than I had expected. His gaze was a little tired, but there was nothing suspicious in it, no hint that he might suspect what I was thinking. "Hey," he said, kissing me on the cheek. "I'm so glad to be back." We went to the living room, and I could no longer shake the feeling that I wasn't where I was supposed to be, that everything wasn't quite as it had been before. I felt how the emptiness inside me became more and more noticeable, and the longer I stayed in this familiar reality, the more distant it seemed. That evening, I felt once again that I was between two worlds, and every choice, every step, now felt like it weighed a ton. The next day, Alex called again. I hadn't expected him to take the initiative so soon, but his voice sounded calm, with no tension, as if everything happening between us was something natural and even expected. "Hey," he said, "I know you don't like crowded places, but how about an outdoor movie? It'll be a bit more casual, relaxed. You can just forget about everything for a couple of hours." "All right," I replied, inwardly deciding that I would spend this day on my own terms. We met late in the evening. The sky above us was a canvas scattered with stars, and there was a silence in the air like in the oldest and coziest films. The place was unusual. Old wooden chairs, people sitting on blankets, an atmosphere unlike the noisy theaters where everyone tries to catch something important. Alex and I settled at the very edge, along the seats, almost alone. I could feel his gaze wrapping around me, penetrating my thoughts. It was something unconscious yet understood. In his presence, everything familiar to me began to feel foreign and too simple. The moment the commercials started, his hand accidentally, almost unconsciously, brushed against mine. I froze. It was a moment I hadn't expected. His touch was different from the one on the beach. There was no lightness here. This wasn't just a touch, it was something more. I looked at his hand, then at his face. He quietly but confidently said, "You're so alive today. I didn't think you could be this truly alive. You always seem like you're in your own world, reserved, but now, it's like you've shed everything that was holding you back. It's nice." After the movie, when people began to disperse, Alex walked me to his car. It was a bit dark, and I didn't know what to do with this new feeling that had arisen inside me, and with this incredible sense of lightness that he had so effortlessly brought into my world. When we reached his car, he stopped, looked at me with such soft insistence, as if his gaze could pin me to this moment forever. He started, and I felt time slow down. His eyes met mine. "I want to kiss you." I didn't pull away. And in that kiss, there was something more than just physical attraction. He gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time. The sense that I could be myself, without masks, without the need to play someone else's roles. When we pulled away, I didn't know how to feel next. But one thing was clear. I couldn't go back. Returning home after that evening felt like stepping into another world, one that I couldn't ignore. George was already home, standing in the hallway with a bag, unpacking his things, and humming to himself. His face was relaxed, but I noticed a tiredness in his eyes. He didn't immediately notice that something had changed in the atmosphere, but I already couldn't ignore what had happened. Something about his presence now felt foreign. "Hey," he said, not looking up from his task. "How are you?" "Hey," I replied, trying not to reveal my anxiety. "Everything's fine." "You look strange," he said, glancing at my face. "Are you hiding something?" The phone on the table vibrated. I looked at the screen. It was Alex. "Come for coffee?" A simple message, but it felt like a challenge. George noticed the movement, and his gaze immediately became more focused. "Who is that?" he asked, not hiding his curiosity. I tried to hide the phone, but it was already too late. He had seen. I felt a lump in my throat start to grow. "It's just an old acquaintance," I said, but my voice sounded unconvincing. I tried to run from the truth again, hoping the moment would pass unnoticed. "You're not going to lie to me, are you?" he asked, and there was steel in his voice. George, I started, but he didn't let me continue. Got it, he said, cutting me off. You've changed. I can feel it. This isn't the first time you've looked like you're missing something, but now it's obvious. You're with him, aren't you? You better tell me, George continued, what you want. Just tell me. In that moment, I realized that everything that had happened in the past few days couldn't end without consequences. George went into the bedroom without saying another word. His steps were sharp, his face closed off. I was left alone, not knowing what to do. With every passing moment, it became clearer to me that I was facing a choice, and it wasn't an easy one. I never thought I could lose everything I had worked so hard for so quickly, and yet the inner voice in my head kept repeating one thing: don't go back.